here. What's up, guys? Happy Thursday. NFL Week 4 is upon us, and it kicks off tonight. Jaguars and the Bengals, Trevor Lawrence and Joe Burrow. It should be a football game. I'll say that. Yep, I will go out there right now, and I will say that will be a football game. Now, hopefully it's a good game. We've seen a lot of good games in primetime so far, even some that we didn't expect to be anything special, turned into somewhat entertaining, if not sloppy, football, which can be entertaining. So I'm holding out for the best, man. And if it's not a good game to watch, hopefully it's a good game to sweat. And that's what daily fantasy sports has created for us, the ability to turn average or below average football games into something that can entertain us on a Thursday night. This video brought to you by Prize Picks. If you're watching this video, you play DFS, you've probably heard about Prize Picks because they're everywhere. At the end of this video, I'm going to give you two of my favorite Prize Picks for tonight's game between the Jaguars and Bengals. If you haven't joined Prize Picks yet, you keep hearing about it, you're on the fence, well, sign up, use code Gundacker, and you will actually get a deposit bonus up to $100. Let's talk about tonight's game. First thing I want to do is talk about the game script of this game that Vegas is giving us. So we're going to check out the Vegas odds tab in the Fantasy Labs portal, and you see that this game has a 46 live over-under, which is a meager total, all things considered, and the Bengals are favored by a massive 7.5 points. The Jaguars implied for just 19.25, while the Bengals implied for 3 touchdowns and maybe a couple of field goals. So as that game progressed into the night, if we let these lines tell the story, we would expect the Bengals to continue to be a team that's not throwing the ball a ton, let Joe Mixon have his say, and then you would expect the Jaguars from trailing, potentially double possessions down to be a little bit more pass happy. With the game script in mind, we'll talk about a couple of touching points for player news and notes that do impact this game significantly to somewhat. First of all, T. Higgins, wide receiver for the Cincinnati Bengals, will miss his second straight game with a shoulder injury. He played 2 games, week 1 and week 2. In those 2 games, he represented 2 touchdowns and 15 targets. His absence is going to help us raise the floor for Tyler Boyd and Jamar Chase. Jaguars kicker Josh Lambo has been ruled out of this game for personal reasons, and because they didn't have his backup in the player pool on DraftKings, who is getting activated from the practice squad, there will not be a rosterable Jaguars kicker for tonight's DraftKings Showdown slate. I don't think you're missing a ton by that happening, but if you are an anti-kicker, or maybe you think Lambo was a great play to begin with, maybe you lose out on some of the field taking shots on him, and maybe that dead money doesn't fill up the player pool, and maybe some people click Lambo's name and not realize he's not going to play. On the defensive side for the Bengals, Trey Waynes, cornerback, going to make his Bengals debut after missing all of last season with a pectoral injury. But 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards for that defense, as fellow cornerback Cheeto Awuzie is listed as doubtful with a groin injury, and safety Jesse Bates is listed as out with a neck injury. Hey, another week of Eli Apple never hurt nobody, right? Jumping into the tiers portion of this video, you guys know how I like to do it. I like to spray 20 lineups and attack these showdowns, and I like to tier my player pool. Tier 1s being guys I will have the most exposure to. Tier 5 being guys I will have little to none, usually none, exposure to in 20 lineups. 2s and 3s are guys that I'll have medium exposure to. Some of those guys might hit a captain line or two, but generally speaking, I'm focusing on my confidence, my projection, and my personal expectation on exposure to these players. Tonight, a lot could change between now and lock, so the only way to stay up to date with that is by keeping up with me in the RunDFS.com premium Discord, or on Twitter, twitter.com/Gundacker. Tier 1, you got to start with the guy, Joe Mixon. Mixon's played 79% of the Bengals' offensive snaps through 3 weeks with 67 carries and 7 targets. He's one of the few bell cow backs left, and the Bengals are 7.5-point home favorites in single game scenarios. I want to be attached to the guys with the highest volume, and Mixon has the highest implied volume for any non-quarterback in this game. I would like to see his targets rise back up after a pair of stout defensive lines in the Bears and Steelers kind of kept those low. But at the same time, I don't think that the Bengals will necessarily have to pass the ball a ton as this game progresses and we feed into the Vegas line. So give me Joe Mixon. I expect him to be the highest owned player on the entire slate, but for good reason. Hopefully, I don't even want to say it, hopefully we won't get a similar situation to what happened last week. Knock on wood, right? Let's take a look at the Jaguars side. Another tier 1 guy I think I'm going to land on, Marvin Jones Jr. He likely leads the Jaguars in pass catching opportunities here tonight. Last week he saw 8 targets. In week 2 he converted 2 of 11 targets. In week 1 he converted 5 of 9 targets. And he's found pay dirt twice. And his steadiness is something I'm going to lean on hard in this projected positive game script. What I mean by that is they're likely going to have to throw the ball quite a bit playing from behind. So if Marvin Jones is going to be the top targeted guy in a PPR format, he's going to be my highest owned Jaguar for sure. And that's why right now I'm going to list him as a tier 1. Next tier 1, let's go back to the Bengals side. Let's talk about Tyler Boyd. I love me some slot receivers in PPR, and Tyler Boyd is slated to run a majority of his routes out of the slot yet again. He's represented over 30% of the team target share the last 2 weeks, and the Jaguars' nickel corner is Chris Claybooks, who is ranked bottom 8 in cornerbacks via Pro Football Focus, allowing 10 receptions on 11 targets for 148 yards and just 46 coverage snaps. I'll talk more about my fear of the Bengals' lack of pass attempts and when I talk about Joe Burrow, but in a single game perspective, he's liable to lead the Bengals in targets, and he provides very decent value as just the 8th most expensive option in this game at $7,400 on DraftKings. So I like him quite a bit, and I'll probably also have some captain lineups featuring Tyler Boyd. And let's move down to the tier 2 category, and let's start with quarterback Joe Burrow. Through the first 3 weeks, the Bengals are passing at a bottom 5 rate in all of football. So how about we stop for a second and discuss some game theory and strategy? Because although I want to start with Burrow as a tier 2, it's mainly because of volume and opportunity. And if I'm being honest, that volume and opportunity is maybe not as high as the field presumes it is based on what his projected ownership is currently sitting at. I expect Joe Burrow to likely be a top 2, top 3 owned player on the slate, with maybe just Joe Mixon competing with him. And he is the highest priced player on the Showdown slate for DraftKings, which not only gives him a responsibility to be a top scorer on the slate, he's also taxed as a quarterback, right? You just have to do more as a quarterback to be more relevant, especially at a high price tag. You're only getting 4 points for a touchdown, and you're getting taxed for your yardage versus rushing yards and receiving yards. And let's be honest, Joe Burrow is not going to be rushing, coming back from that injury last year. So far this season, he does have 5 qualifying rushing attempts, but it's more so scrambling out of the pocket, and he's only collected 9 total yards rushing on the season. So in a realistic perspective and a realistic range of outcome here, if this game plays to the 7.5-point spread in Joe Burrow's Bengals favors without T. Higgins, you would likely expect Burrow to continue this trend of throwing the ball under 30 times. 27 pass attempts in week 1 against Minnesota, a 3-point game. 30 pass attempts in week 2 against the Chicago Bears in a 3-point game. And then last week, with a healthy lead over the Pittsburgh Steelers, he threw the ball less than 20 times, 18 to be exact. And what kept him relevant was an extremely efficient touchdown rate. 3 touchdowns last week, and then a pair of touchdowns in week 1 and week 2. The pass attempts, the volume, there's enough risk here to say that if Joe Burrow only threw for 1 touchdown tonight, he might be an easy fade when it comes to the price point on him versus guys that will maybe get 4, 5, 6, 7 receptions and get 50 plus yards, and one of those guys to get the touchdown, likely a better play here. So I really think there's an argument and something to sit on and think about pushing Joe Burrow down to a tier 3. Right now, my projection likes him to be, one of the top fantasy point producers in this game. And I also am kind of buying into a little bit of Burrow to chase LSU narrative, what have you. But that is something to really consider, and at least a thought I wanted to share with you guys. So you guys let me know what you think in the comments below about that little piece of game theory. Do you think it's worth being a little bit lower on Joe Burrow here? The only reason I'm keeping it as a tier 2 for now is because my fantasy projections actually list him as a top 3 scorer on in this game. But, that doesn't necessarily mean he's a nut play when it comes to value, right? I know raw points mean a lot in Showdown, but there's a world where, he only gets to 15 fantasy points, and maybe that, 14, 13 fantasy points from a guy's a little bit cheaper, get those guys together in a lineup versus having to get to Burrow at his price and a pure punt play that doesn't come through. Maybe that works out a little bit better, and because Joe Burrow likely gets top 2 ownership on the slate, maybe that just creates incredible leverage for those big field tournaments to that, for that $1 million to first. So something to think about. I'm definitely interested to hear what you guys might think about that idea and what you're personally going to do with Joe Burrow. Next up, I want to talk about running back James Robinson from the Jaguars side, and this is a volume play. Although Robinson's snap count wasn't fantastic last week, he had an incredible usage rate when he was on the field. He saw 15 carries for an efficient 88 yards rushing, and he caught all 6 of his targets for 46 yards. He'll get a chance at a defense that saw Ben Roethlisberger target running back Najee Harris 19 times last week, and they let Dalvin Cook do what Dalvin Cook does in week 1. I'm not saying James Robinson is going to curtain call that. That would be an outlandish statement, but at least we know the roadway is paved in positive opportunity. Robinson has run 70 passing routes on the season, so I do like his chance to continue to get peppered in from a PPR standpoint, and I think volume counts in single game scenarios. So I do like James Robinson right now, thinking about having tier 2 exposure to him. Another guy I want tier 2 exposure to, it's going to be Ja'Marr Chase. It's going to be a lot of fun to see Joe Burrow throwing to his old LSU receiver Ja'Marr Chase on primetime television, the Island game. The main pushback I would have here is the Bengals have not asked Joe Burrow to throw the ball a lot. But when he does throw the ball, since we know T. Higgins is out, it's likely going to be, 60 to 65% of the time to a Tyler Boyd or a Ja'Marr Chase. Now, I have Tyler Boyd as a tier 1 right now. I think his floor is a little bit higher, but Ja'Marr Chase absolutely can ball. Last week, T. Higgins was out. Ja'Marr Chase got only 5 targets, but 5 targets was good for 33% of the team's target share. So if you expect a few more passes here, even if it's not 30 pass attempts, but you expect maybe 25, 28 pass attempts from Joe Burrow, you're probably going to get a high floor of targets for Ja'Marr Chase, and you get the narrative to have a little bit of fun with it. One thing to watch for is the regression monster for touchdowns might be on the way. So far, Ja'Marr Chase has found the end zone in every game thus far. And with that said, you're not going to score a touchdown every game, so maybe his ownership rises to a point that he's over-owned. However, opportunity is still going to be there. He's still going to be top 2 in targets, and arguably top 1 depending on your thoughts on Boyd. I like Boyd's matchup a little bit better corner-wise. So I'm going Boyd tier 1, but Ja'Marr Chase is right there for me. Don't mind him quite a bit. Do you guys disagree with that? Are you flip-flopping? Looks like Ja'Marr Chase is kind of the fun name to click, and hey, I got no quarrels against that. I definitely will have my share of Ja'Marr Chase tonight, but I'm going to have a little bit more Tyler Boyd. You guys let me know what you're doing with that. Let's move on to the tier 3 area, and let's talk about quarterback Trevor Lawrence. I'm gambling on the number 1 pick in a positive game script. On paper, the Bengals defense is bolstering a presentable passing defense when it comes to yards allowed and metrics overall. But if you really put a little context to it, Think about the quarterbacks they've seen in the last 2 weeks. The corpse of Ben Roethlisberger, Andy Dalton, and an unprepared Justin Fields. And then they let Kirk Cousins throw for over 300 yards. Could the strength of schedule in a short sample size be strengthening their numbers? I think it's possible. Trevor Lawrence definitely hasn't been great, but he's still a rookie. He's got 3 starts behind him now. He's in a pass-favorable game script. And there's a couple of metrics I like for him to maybe see a little bit of breakout opportunity. If we take a look at next-gen stats, here's a fun fact for you. When it comes to average intended air yards, Trevor Lawrence thus far is 3rd in the NFL behind just Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. Behind him, Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers. We're talking gunslingers, right? And his expected completion rate, and this is it's feeling a little bit like baseball with metrics that sound this advanced. He's got a 62.6% expected completion rate, and so far just a 54% completion rate. So there's a little bit of room to believe in progression for the number 1 overall pick. There's a little bit of room to believe in regression for the Bengals defense that was one of the worst defenses in the league last year. So I do like the thought of Trevor Lawrence in a pass-happy game script, being 7.5-point road dogs. And I think tier 3 is where I got him right now. But put that with my maybe concerns about Joe Burrow, I may get a little freaky later and upgrade Lawrence to a tier 2 and maybe downgrade Burrow to a tier 3 and just approach it with a, pure GPP mindset. And Trevor Lawrence's first 3 games, a surprisingly good Tyrod Taylor-led Texans team in week 1, your first NFL game, Butterflies. A lot of rookies tanked their NFL debut. Week 2, it gets a Broncos defense that probably finishes top 5 in the league. And then last week, I think the Cardinals defense is really good and still a little bit underrated. They've definitely made some adjustments, especially that defensive front. Chandler Jones is a beast. So Trevor Lawrence has had a tougher strength of schedule than he's getting credit for. And I think we're seeing that with the expected completion rate being what it is. So I don't want to sound like a Trevor Lawrence apologist. I get it. He's created a lot of turnovers, but I still think he was a number 1 overall pick for a reason. And, this is a defense that I'm not buying in completely. Who do I like with Trevor Lawrence? Hey, how about some DJ Chark? In week 1, he caught 3 of 12 targets, but he turned those 3 receptions into 80-plus yards and a touchdown. Week 2, tough matchup against the Broncos D, caught just 1 of 4. And last week, turned 3 receptions on 6 targets, finding the end zone. He's volatile, I get it, but he's the home run guy. I just talked about Trevor Lawrence's average intended air yards. A lot of those air yards are intended for DJ Chark. Chark has the 4th highest average depth of target in the league of any receiver with at least 14 targets. Chark feels closer to boom or bust than I'd like to, but in a projected pass-happy game script, he makes a lot of sense here, especially at tier 3 levels of ownership, and especially in those Trevor Lawrence lines. He's 1 play away from being a nutty play in a showdown format, even if it doesn't happen until midway through the 4th quarter. Give me some DJ Chark. And moving down to the tier 4 area, this is going to be guys that I think are viable enough that I want some exposure to, but I'm not going to get too aggressive with them because they're extremely volatile, right? Low floor, medium to high ceiling depending on their price point, and in a single game showdown, you don't necessarily need high ceiling plays, right? We've seen guys with single digits win tournaments a couple times so far, and we've also seen, in years past, guys with zeros from the couple $100 also find their way into the top lineup. So tier 4s are going to be guys that I have exposure to. Most of these guys I probably don't get more than 25% as a number obscurely picked. Maybe a couple of these guys make a case to get a little bit higher owned, and I'll try and touch on them individually. First guy I'm going to talk about, Laviska Shenault. He's underperformed results-wise so far versus his preseason hype. We're hoping for an increase in targets as Trevor Lawrence gains more confidence, as this team starts to gel more, and as they hopefully see better matchups. And I think, we look at the last couple of matchups, it's fair to take some of the pressure off of blaming the Jaguars for inherently being bad, and maybe expecting some progression going forward. We were on LaVisca preseason for a reason, right? But with that said, we have to project DJ Chark, Marvin Jones, and James Robinson above him in usage. So because of that, we got a tier 4 him at best right now. Carlos Hyde, he's under 2K. I could see 8+ touches, including a target 2 for him. So if he, managed to make the most of 8 touches, broke off a 20-30 yard run, maybe a couple catches for 20 yards, and if he found the end zone, he probably is the bona fide nuts at that price point. But the main reason being, I'm going to get 8 to 10 touches more than likely at under 2K, so I'm going to have some of him. Talk about tight end Jacob Hollister. He's just 1K on DraftKings, and he's kind of in a unique spot to talk through. Long story short, their guy that they were leaning on to be the pass-catching tight end, James O'Shaughnessy, gets injured after looking like a decent option in week 1, and then 2 weeks of purgatory for tight ends last week. Jacob Hollister, who came from Seattle, saw 6 targets. 2 of those targets resulted in an interception. One of them was a drop by Jacob Hollister. And then Monday, the Jaguars were like, all right, maybe we should beef up our tight end spot because O'Shaughnessy got put on the injured reserve. So the Jaguars called Carolina and made a trade. They sent cornerback CJ Henderson in exchange for tight end Dan Arnold. So they rob us of the Darnold to Arnold connection, and they now have what's likely to be their pass-catching tight end of the near future in Dan Arnold. The caveat being that trade was Monday, right? He probably gets to the team Tuesday, so at best Tuesday, Wednesday, to look and learn some plays. So how involved should we realistically expect Dan Arnold to be tonight? I'm just saying a couple of catches have shown to go a long way for these really cheap options in the flex in our showdown formats. Let's move on to kicker Evan Mcpherson of the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm fine if you think you want to take his raw points and push him up to a tier 3 if you didn't believe that the Jaguars could produce. I don't normally like to get too attached to kickers. Usually I'll cap him at 30%. Maybe since tonight we only have one playable kicker, he becomes a little bit more viable and you can push him to maybe 40-45%. At his price point, if he did produce 10 DKP, he's probably a pretty steady piece. And lastly, for tier 4, I'm going to talk about wide receiver Auden Tate. Weird name, I get it. Hey, last week, no T. Higgins. We saw Tate play 27 snaps, right? It's not fair to expect 100% of snaps out of Boyd, Jamar Chase. So Tate could be in there to spell some snaps, and that was the case last week. 27 snaps his way, and then Mike Thomas, the other Bengals receiver, saw 10 snaps. So the seesaw went Tate's way. No reason not to expect that to stay the same here. I wouldn't hold my breath for more than 1 or 2 targets, but he's $400. Knock on wood, he's an injury away from being somewhat involved in this offense, right? I know they're not going to pass a lot, but man, he is really, really cheap. So I like Auden Tate as a tier 4 guy to have a little bit of exposure to. Don't get crazy, but a little bit of exposure to. And that's going to leave me tier 5ing everything else. Jaguars D for sure in the tier 5. Arnold at 4K, unless there's like significant information that he's going to be heavily evolved, I'm probably going to stay away from him. Lambo, you can't play him. He's not going to be active. Luke Farrell, the same thing. A bunch of tight ends that we don't know who's going to do what. CJ Uzoma, I don't really have a lot of interest in going his way on what looks to be a low pass attempt offense. If he got there, he got there, is what it is. And then the Bengals defense. I don't hate the idea of getting to the Bengals defense as a tier 4. And that's probably like by rule, 10% exposure. I probably get to 10%. I hate playing defenses, but I have a mind for the Jaguars here. I just have like kind of a sweet tooth for them to maybe surprise people tonight. But hey, man, Trevor Lawrence has created turnovers by hook or by crook. We've seen him fumble, and we've seen him throw more interceptions than touchdowns. So there's a world where the Bengals defense comes to play, and maybe they are a team that, even though I think they're overperforming through the first couple weeks, maybe they are still better than what we expect them to be. I probably think instead of lazily putting them at a tier 5, I'll put them as a tier 4, but likely going to be one of my lower owned tier 4 options, but I definitely don't mind creating some mindset lineups that feature the Bengals defense and then just like a Marvin Jones on the other side. And that's what I got for tonight's game between the Bengals and Jaguars. Let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with, and as promised, here are two of my favorite Prize Picks selections for tonight's game. First of all, I like Tyler Boyd to get over 13 fantasy points. They do PPR scoring. I like his shot tonight. And then James Robinson over 20.5 receiving yards. Two plays I like a lot. Let me know if you tail them. Otherwise, twitter.com/Gundacker. I'll see you guys in the live stream for baseball if you are into baseball. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. I love you guys. Good luck. God bless. Go win some money.